You know that moment when someone looks at you with complete disgust, like you're nothing more than dirt under their shoe? Well, I experienced that feeling every single family gathering for 3 years straight. My name is Marcus, and I'm 28 years old. For the longest time, my family treated me like I was the black sheep, the failure, the one who couldn't get his life together. But what they didn't know was that I was quietly building an empire right under their noses, and when the truth finally came out, well, let's just say the look on their faces was worth every sleepless night I endured. 3 years ago, I was working the morning shift at McDonald's on Elm Street Inn. Not downtown Phoenix, exactly glamorous, I know. But while my family saw failure, I saw opportunity. While they mocked my uniform and minimum wage paycheck, I was studying every single aspect of that business like my life depended on it. Because honestly, it did. My family never let me forget where I stood in their hierarchy. My older brother David worked as a financial advisor, pulling in 6 figures and never missing a chance to remind everyone about his success. My sister Amanda was a marketing executive at some fancy tech company, always posting about her latest business trips and expensive dinners on social media. Then there was me, Marcus, the guy who smelled like French fries and wore a name tag to work. The worst part wasn't the job itself. I actually enjoyed the work, the fast pace, the teamwork, the direct connection with customers. What crushed me was sitting at family dinners while David explained complex investment strategies and Amanda dropped names of Fortune 500 clients, and then having Mum ask me, with that pitying tone, how my little job at McDonald's was going. The emphasis she put on little job felt like a knife twisting in my chest every single time. Christmas dinner 2 years ago was particularly brutal. We were all gathered around my parents' dining room table, the good china gleaming under the chandelier, when Uncle Robert asked about everyone's career updates. David launched into his latest promotion, Amanda bragged about landing a major client, and then all eyes turned to me. The silence stretched uncomfortably as I tried to figure out what to say about my McDonald's position that wouldn't sound completely pathetic. My cousin Jessica, who worked in real estate, actually laughed out loud when I mentioned I was learning about restaurant operations. She said, and I quote, "Marcus, you're flipping burgers, not running General Electric. Let's be realistic about what you're actually doing there." The entire table erupted in laughter. Even my own mother chuckled behind her napkin. But here's what none of them understood. While they saw me as just another fast food worker, I was absorbing everything. I studied the morning rush patterns, analysed why certain promotional campaigns worked, while others floised the supply-opt member chain logistics, understood the labour cost calculations down to the minute. I watched how the franchise owner, Mrs. Chen, managed her 3 locations, how she negotiated with suppliers, how she handled staffing challenges during busy periods. Mrs. Chen became my unofficial mentor, though she probably didn't realise it at the time. She'd come in during the breakfast rush, clipboard in hand, observing everything with sharp eyes. I noticed how she'd check the temperature logs, review the cash register reports, and have quiet conversations with the managers about efficiency improvements. She never talked down to any of us employees. Instead, she'd ask questions about what we observed during our shifts, what problems we encountered, what suggestions we had for making things run smoother. After about 6 months of working there, I started asking Mrs. Chen more direct questions during her visits. How did she decide which locations to purchase? What made a McDonald's franchise profitable versus struggling? How much did it actually cost to buy into the system? She seemed surprised by my genuine interest, but she was always willing to share insights. Most people, she told me, saw McDonald's as a simple business, but the successful franchisees understood it was actually incredibly complex, requiring skills in operations management, financial planning, marketing, human resources, and customer service all rolled into one. That's when I started doing serious research. Every night after my shift, I'd go home to my tiny studio apartment and dive into franchise disclosure documents, industry reports, financial projections, and success stories of other McDonald's franchisees. I learned that the average McDonald's franchise generates about $2.7 million in annual revenue, with profit margins typically ranging from 8 to 15% depending on location and management efficiency. I discovered that the initial investment for a McDonald's franchise ranges from $1 to $2.3 million, depending on the size and location of the restaurant. Most importantly, I learned that McDonald's corporate doesn't just hand out franchises to anyone with money. They want operators who understand the business from the ground up, who have experience in restaurant operations, who can demonstrate leadership skills and financial responsibility. In other words, they wanted someone exactly like what I was becoming, though my family had no idea. The turning point came during a particularly humiliating family barbecue last summer. David had just bought a new BMW and was showing it off in my parents' driveway. Amanda was fresh back from a work conference in Miami, posting Instagram stories of her hotel suite and expensive dinners. Meanwhile, I pulled up in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, still wearing my McDonald's polo shirt because I'd come straight from a double shift. My dad's neighbour, Mr. Peterson, who'd always been friendly to me, asked how work was going. Before I could answer, David jumped in with his usual routine about how I needed to get serious about my career, how working at McDonald's was fine for teenagers but embarrassing for someone approaching 30. Amanda nodded along, adding that I should consider going back to school, or at least applying for jobs with actual growth potential. The conversation spiraled from there. My cousin Tom, who'd recently started his own landscaping business, suggested I could come work for him doing yard work, which would at least be more respectable than fast food. My Aunt Linda mentioned that her friend's daughter worked at a bank and maybe could put in a good word for me as a teller. Everyone had opinions about what I should do with my life, and every suggestion felt like another way of saying that what I was currently doing was worthless. But Mr. Peterson, bless him, asked a different question. He wanted to know what I'd learned about business from working in restaurants. That simple question opened a floodgate. I found myself explaining franchise operations, profit margins, supply chain management, customer retention strategies, labour optimization, and market analysis. I talked about how McDonald's corporate training programs work, how they select and develop new franchisees, how they maintain quality standards across thousands of locations worldwide. The backyard went completely quiet. David's mouth was literally hanging open. Amanda had stopped scrolling through her phone and was actually listening. My parents looked confused, like they couldn't reconcile this business analysis with their image of their failure son who flipped burgers for a living. Mr. Peterson was fascinated. He started asking follow-up questions about franchise profitability, expansion strategies, and what it takes to become a successful multi-unit operator. I answered every question confidently, backing up my points with specific data and real examples I'd observed during my time working in the restaurants. After that conversation, something shifted. Not with my family, unfortunately. They seemed to dismiss my knowledge as just random trivia I'd picked up, not recognizing it as the foundation of a serious business plan. But I realized that I actually knew more about McDonald's operations than most people who'd never worked in the system. I understood the business not just from spreadsheets and corporate presentations, but from the ground level where the actual work happens. That's when I made my decision. I was going to buy a McDonald's franchise. Not someday, not eventually, but as soon as humanly possible. I started putting together a comprehensive business plan, complete with market analysis for potential locations, detailed financial projections, and a timeline for franchise acquisition. I researched every available territory in the Phoenix metropolitan area, studying traffic patterns, demographic data, competition analysis, and growth projections. The financial requirements were daunting. Even with financing, I'd need substantial liquid capital for the initial investment, plus operating funds for the first year. My McDonald's salary wasn't going to cut it, obviously, so I started working overtime shifts whenever possible, picked up catering gigs on weekends, and began aggressively saving every penny I could. I moved to an even smaller apartment, sold my car and bought a used motorcycle, cancelled every subscription service, and basically lived like a monk for 8 months. But saving alone wasn't going to be enough. I needed to demonstrate to McDonald's corporate that I had the business acumen and leadership experience they required in their franchisees. So I started volunteering for additional responsibilities at work. I helped train new employees, covered manager shifts when people called in sick, and worked closely with Mrs. Chen on operational improvements. Mrs. Chen noticed my increased involvement and started giving me more complex projects. She had me analyze sales data to identify slow periods where we could optimize staffing. She asked me to research new promotional strategies that other franchises were using successfully. She even had me sit in on supplier meetings and district manager calls so I could understand the broader business relationships that made the franchise system work. After about a year of this intensive learning and saving, I felt ready to take the next step. I scheduled a meeting with Mrs. Chen to discuss my franchise ambitions. I was nervous as hell, worried she might think I was overstepping or being unrealistic about my capabilities. But when I laid out my business plan, showed her my financial preparations, and explained my long-term vision for multi-unit ownership, her reaction surprised me. She smiled and said she'd been wondering when I was going to ask about becoming a franchisee myself. Apparently, my questions and observations over the past year had made it obvious that I was thinking beyond just working for someone else. She offered to serve as a reference for my franchise application and to mentor me through the process of site selection and business setup. That conversation happened 6 months ago. Since then, I've been working through McDonald's rigorous franchise approval process, which involves financial verification, business plan review, multiple interviews with regional managers, and completion of their intensive training program. The whole process typically takes 6 to 12 months from application to restaurant opening. The training program was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. McDonald's doesn't mess around when it comes to preparing their franchisees. I spent 2 weeks at Hamburger University in Chicago, which sounds ridiculous, but is actually one of the most comprehensive business training programs in the world. We covered everything from financial management and marketing strategies to leadership development and crisis management. The other students in my training cohort were impressive. There was a former military officer who'd managed logistics for overseas operations, a retail executive who'd run multiple store locations, and a restaurant industry veteran who already owned successful Subway franchises. Then there was me, the guy who'd spent the last 3 years working behind the counter at McDonald's. But here's the thing that became clear during those intensive training sessions. While my fellow trainees had impressive resumes and business experience, I had something they didn't. I understood McDonald's operations from the inside out. When our instructor talked about managing labor costs during peak hours, I could describe exactly how that played out in real time during the breakfast rush. When we discussed inventory management and waste reduction, I had first-hand experience with the daily challenges and practical solutions. The training covered financial projections in detail, and the numbers were both exciting and terrifying. A well-run McDonald's franchise in a good location typically generates between $2.5 and $3.2 million in annual revenue. After paying franchise fees, food costs, labor, rent, and other operating expenses, a successful franchisee can expect to net between $150,000 and $400,000 per year from a single location. The top performers, those who really understand the business and execute flawlessly, can push that number even higher, but the investment required was substantial. The franchise fee alone was $45,000, and that was just the beginning. Equipment, signage, seating, kitchen setup, initial inventory, and working capital brought the total investment to approximately $1.8 million for the location I was targeting. Even with financing covering most of that amount, I needed to demonstrate liquid capital of at least $500,000. That's where my secret weapon came into play. For the past 18 months, while my family thought I was just wasting my life at a dead-end job, I'd been making strategic investments in cryptocurrency and growth stocks. Every dollar I saved from my McDonald's paychecks and side gigs went straight into carefully researched investments. I'd spent countless hours studying market trends, reading financial reports, and learning from successful investors online. The timing couldn't have been better. My initial investment of $23,000 in various cryptocurrencies had grown to over $180,000 during the bull market. My stock picks, focused on emerging technology companies and sustainable energy, had performed even better, turning $31,000 into nearly $240,000. Combined with my aggressive saving and a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never mentioned to my family, I had accumulated just over $520,000 in liquid assets. When I submitted my financial documentation to McDonald's corporate, the regional development manager called me personally. He said it was unusual to see someone my age with that level of liquid capital, especially someone currently working as an hourly employee. I explained my investment strategy and showed him the detailed records I'd maintained of every transaction. He was impressed not just by the financial results, but by the disciplined approach I'd taken to building wealth while living on a minimal budget. The site selection process took another 3 months. McDonald's corporate has incredibly strict criteria for new locations. They analyze traffic patterns, demographic data, competition, visibility, accessibility, and growth projections before approving any site. The location I ultimately selected was a former chain restaurant that had closed down in a busy shopping district about 15 miles from where I'd been working. The demographics were perfect. The area had a mix of families, young professionals, and college students. Traffic counts showed over 35,000 vehicles per day passing the location. There were 3 major office complexes within a 2-mile radius, a community college campus nearby, and several residential developments that had been built in the past 5 years. Most importantly, the nearest McDonald's was over 4 miles away, so I wouldn't be competing with existing franchisees. The renovation and setup process was intense. McDonald's has detailed specifications for everything from kitchen equipment placement to dining room layout to exterior signage. I worked closely with approved contractors to transform the former restaurant space into a modern McDonald's location. The process took 4 months and cost exactly what the projections had estimated. During construction, I started hiring and training my initial staff. McDonald's provides comprehensive training materials and support, but as a franchisee, you're responsible for building and managing your team. I hired 2 assistant managers with restaurant experience, 6 full-time crew members, and 12 part-time employees to cover all shifts and provide scheduling flexibility. The training process was where my background really paid off. Because I'd worked every position in a McDonald's restaurant, I could train my employees not just on procedures, but on the reasoning behind those procedures. I could explain why we follow specific timing protocols during rush periods, why consistent portion control matters for both cost management and customer satisfaction, and how teamwork and communication make the difference between a smooth shift and a chaotic one. 3 weeks before our scheduled opening, I decided it was time to tell my family what I'd been working toward. I couldn't keep it secret much longer anyway, since the local newspaper was planning to run a story about the new McDonald's franchise opening in the area. I invited everyone over for Sunday dinner at my parents' house, just like we'd done hundreds of times before. David showed up in his BMW, Amanda arrived in her leased Mercedes, and I pulled up on my motorcycle like always. The familiar dynamic was in full effect within minutes. David was talking about his latest client acquisition, Amanda was complaining about her demanding boss, and my parents were asking their usual polite but patronizing questions about my little job. My dad made his typical joke about how I'd probably get promoted to shift supervisor eventually if I kept working hard. My mum suggested I should think about taking some business classes at the community college, maybe work toward becoming a restaurant manager someday. The conversation was following its predictable script, with me playing the role of the family disappointment who needed their advice and encouragement. But this time, I had something different to contribute to the conversation. I waited until dessert was served and everyone was settled and relaxed. Then I cleared my throat and said I had some news to share about my career. David immediately jumped in with some comment about how it was about time I got serious about my future. Amanda nodded approvingly and said she hoped I was finally ready to listen to their advice about finding a real job. I smiled and pulled out a folder I'd brought with me. Inside were copies of my franchise agreement, the business license for my new restaurant, photos of the renovation in progress, and my projected financial statements for the first year of operations. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced at a family gathering. My dad picked up the franchise agreement and stared at it like he couldn't believe what he was reading. My mum looked at the business license with my name listed as the owner and franchisee. David grabbed the financial projections and started studying the numbers with the intensity he usually reserved for his own investment portfolios. Amanda was the first one to speak. She asked if this was some kind of joke, if I was pranking them with fake documents. When I assured her everything was completely legitimate, she wanted to know how I'd possibly managed to qualify for a McDonald's franchise. That's when I explained everything. The 3 years of intensive learning and observation, the mentorship from Mrs. Chen, the careful financial planning and investment strategy, the rigorous application and training process, the site selection and renovation project that was currently underway. I told them about Hamburger University and the comprehensive business training I'd completed. I explained the financial requirements and showed them documentation of my liquid assets and investment returns. I described the market analysis I'd conducted for my chosen location and the growth projections that McDonald's corporate had approved. David's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect as he reviewed my business plan and financial documentation. He admitted that the investment strategy I'd followed was more sophisticated than what many of his own clients achieved. Amanda seemed stunned by the marketing and operational analysis I'd prepared for the franchise application. My parents looked like they were trying to process information that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew about my capabilities and ambitions. My dad asked how long I'd been planning this. and when I told him it had been my goal for almost 3 years, he just shook his head in amazement. But the real shock came when I told them the opening date for my restaurant and invited them all to attend the grand opening celebration. My McDonald's franchise would be opening its doors in exactly 12 days. The grand opening was scheduled for a Friday morning at 6 a.m. I'd spent weeks planning every detail of the launch, from the promotional campaigns to the staffing schedule to the inventory management. McDonald's corporate provided support and guidance, but ultimately the success or failure of opening day would come down to execution and preparation. The week leading up to opening was a blur of final inspections, equipment testing, and staff training. The health department conducted their evaluation, and we passed with flying colours. The district manager from McDonald's corporate came by for a final walkthrough and pronounced everything ready for launch. My team had practiced our procedures until they could execute them flawlessly even under pressure. But despite all the preparation, I was nervous as hell. This wasn't just another restaurant opening. This was the culmination of 3 years of planning, saving, learning, and working toward a goal that nobody in my family had taken seriously until now. The financial investment represented almost everything I'd managed to accumulate. If this venture failed, I'd be starting over from scratch at 30 years old. My family's reaction to the grand opening invitation was mixed. My parents seemed genuinely excited and proud, though I could tell they were still processing the dramatic shift in how they viewed my capabilities. They kept asking questions about the business plan and financial projections, as if they couldn't quite believe their underachieving son had put together something so comprehensive and professional. David's response was more complicated. He was clearly impressed by the investment returns I'd achieved in business, the acumen I'd demonstrated, but I could sense some resentment about having misjudged me so completely. For 3 years, he'd positioned himself as the successful brother giving advice to his struggling sibling. Now he had to reckon with the fact that his struggling sibling had quietly built something more he'd accomplished substantial than anything his corporated career. Amanda seemed torn between admiration and embarrassment. As a marketing executive, she recognized the sophistication of the market analysis and promotional I'd developed strategied, but she'd also spent years making jokes about my McDonald's job to her friends and colleagues. Now she had to figure out how to explain that her brother wasn't just a fast food worker, but actually experienced as a successful entrepreneur who'd used his restaurant a launching pad for franchise ownership. The most interesting reaction came from Mrs. Chen, my former boss and mentor. When I stopped by her restaurants to invite her to the opening, she smiled knowingly and said she'd been expecting this conversation for months. She'd watched me develop from an enthusiastic employee into someone who understood the franchise business better than most people who'd been in it for years. She told me something that I'll never forget. She said that in her 15 years as a McDonald's franchisee, she'd seen hundreds of employees come and go. Most of them viewed the job as temporary, something to do while they figured out their real career path. But a few rare individuals understood that the restaurant business wasn't a stepping stone to something better. It was something better if you approached it with the right mindset and commitment. The night before opening, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through checklists in my head, reviewing procedures, and imagining everything that could possibly go wrong. What if the equipment malfunctioned? What if we ran out of key ingredients during the breakfast rush? What if my staff panicked under pressure? What if customers complained about long wait times or poor service? Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and drove to the restaurant. I used my key to let myself in and walked through the empty dining room, checking everything one more time. The equipment was humming quietly in the kitchen. The cash registers were loaded and ready. The initial inventory was properly stocked and organised. Everything looked perfect, but I still felt that knot of anxiety in my stomach. I was standing behind the counter imagining what the morning rush would look like, when I heard a car pull into the parking lot. Through the window I saw Mrs. Chen getting out of her vehicle. She'd apparently had the same idea about doing a final check before opening day. She knocked on the door and I let her in. We walked through the restaurant together, and she pointed out details I'd gotten exactly right. The workflow between stations was optimized for efficiency. The customer service area was welcoming and functional. The kitchen setup followed McDonald's specifications while incorporating small improvements she'd learned from running her own locations. Then she asked me a question that caught me off guard. She wanted to know what my long-term vision was for the franchise. Did I see this as a single location that would provide a comfortable income, or was I thinking bigger? Was I planning to eventually acquire additional territories and become a multi-unit operator? I told her about my 5-year plan. If the first location performed according to projections, I wanted to open a second restaurant within 18 months. McDonald's corporate encouraged franchisees to expand once they demonstrated success, and there were several attractive territories available in the greater Phoenix area. My ultimate goal was to own and operate 4 to 6 locations, which would generate enough revenue to make me genuinely wealthy, rather than just comfortable. She nodded approvingly and shared some advice about multi-unit operations. The skills required to run multiple restaurants successfully were different from managing a single location. You had to develop systems for remote monitoring, delegate more responsibility to managers, and maintain quality standards across multiple sites. But the financial rewards made the additional complexity worthwhile. By the time she left, I felt more confident about what I was attempting. This wasn't just a career change or a business experiment. This was the foundation of something much larger, a pathway to the kind of financial independence and professional respect that my family had always assumed was beyond my reach. Opening day arrived grey and drizzling, typical October weather in Phoenix. I arrived at 4:30 in the morning to begin final preparations with my management team. We reviewed the day's schedule, confirmed that all staff members were ready for their shifts, and did a last-minute inventory check to make sure we had sufficient supplies for what we hoped would be a busy first day. The promotional campaign had been running for 2 weeks, advertising our grand opening specials and highlighting the fact that this was a brand new McDonald's location with state-of-the-art equipment and a fresh, modern design. I'd also arranged for local radio station remote broadcasts and coordinated with the Chamber of Commerce to host a ribbon-cutting ceremony at noon. My family started arriving around 5:45, just 15 minutes before we officially opened to the public. My parents looked proud but nervous, like they weren't quite sure how to behave at their son's business launch. David showed up in a suit, clearly treating this as a significant professional event. Amanda brought her camera and started taking photos of everything from the exterior signage to the kitchen equipment. At exactly 6 a.m., I unlocked the front doors and flipped on the open sign. My first customer was an elderly gentleman who'd been waiting in his car for 10 minutes, apparently eager to try the new McDonald's in his neighborhood. He ordered a simple breakfast combo, but as I handed him his receipt, he congratulated me on opening the restaurant and said he was impressed by how clean and modern everything looked. The rush started, breakfasted slowly but built steadily as word spread, and commuters discovered the new location on their way to work. By 7:30 we had a steady stream of customers, and my staff was executing flawlessly. The kitchen was keeping up with orders, the service was fast and friendly, and the dining room was buzzing with positive energy. David positioned himself near the cash registers where he could observe operations and customer interactions. I noticed him taking notes on his phone, probably analysing our workflow and efficiency metrics with his business consultant mindset. Amanda was documenting everything on social media, posting photos and updates about her brother's restaurant opening. The morning rush peaked around 8:15, with a line of customers stretching almost to the door. This was the real test of everything we'd trained for. Multiple orders coming in simultaneously, complex customizations, time pressure, and the need to maintain quality standards while moving quickly. My team handled it beautifully. The crew members I'd hired were experienced and professional. The assistant managers kept everything organised and efficient. The kitchen staff maintained perfect timing and consistency, and I moved between positions as needed, supporting wherever the workload was heaviest. By 9 a.m, the initial rush had subsided and we could take a breath. I looked around the dining room and saw families enjoying breakfast together, business people grabbing coffee before meetings, and elderly couples reading newspapers while sharing hash browns. This was what I'd been working toward for 3 years, not just owning a business, but creating a place that served the community and provided value to people's daily routines. The ribbon-cutting ceremony at noon was surprisingly well attended. The mayor showed up along with several city council members and Chamber of Commerce representatives. The local newspaper sent a photographer and reporter. Mrs. Chen was there with her management team from her other locations. Even some of my former co-workers from the Elm Street McDonald's came by to congratulate me and see what I'd built. But the most meaningful moment came when the reporter asked me to describe my background and how I'd prepare ownership. I explained franchised my 3 years of restaurant experience, the intensive training I'd completed, and the market research that had guided my site selection. When he asked about my investment in the business, I mentioned the disciplined saving plan and strategic investments that had provided the necessary capital. David was standing nearby during the interview, and I saw his expression change as he heard me discuss investment strategies and financial planning with the same confidence he brought to his own professional conversations. Amanda was nodding along as I described the marketing analysis and promotional campaigns I'd developed. My parents just looked amazed, like they were discovering capabilities in their son that they'd never suspected existed. After the ceremony concluded and most of the crowd had dispersed, my family gathered in the dining room for what turned out to be one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had as adults. My dad admitted that he'd completely underestimated my potential and apologized for the years of dismissive comments about my McDonald's job. My mum said she was proud of what I'd accomplished, but also embarrassed that she'd failed to recognize my ambition and planning. David's apology was more complex. He acknowledged that he'd been condescending and unsupportive, but he also admitted that part of his reaction had been defensive. Seeing me succeed in something he didn't understand had forced him to question his own assumptions about success and professional achievement. He'd always measured worth by salary and job titles, but watching me build something from the ground up had expanded his perspective. Amanda was characteristically direct. She said she owed me apologies for years of jokes and dismissive comments, and she wanted to know if there were ways she could help promote the restaurant through her marketing connections. She also asked if I'd be interested in her helping develop more sophisticated promotional campaigns as the business grew. The lunch rush that followed was even busier than breakfast had been. Word was spreading through social media and local networks that the new McDonald's was well run, fast, and friendly. We served over 400 customers during the lunch period, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. By closing time on opening day, we generated over $3,000 in sales, which exceeded even the optimistic projections McDonald's corporate had provided. More importantly, the operations had run smoothly, my staff had performed excellently, and customer satisfaction appeared to be very high based on the comments and compliments we'd received throughout the day. That evening, after all the staff had gone home and I'd completed the closing procedures, I sat alone in my restaurant and tried to process what had just happened. 3 years ago, I'd been the family disappointment working a dead-end job that nobody respected. Today, I was a successful business owner with a profitable franchise and genuine prospects for expansion and growth. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But every hour I'd spent learning about franchise operations, every dollar I'd saved instead of spent on luxuries, every night I'd researched investment opportunities and market trends had contributed to this moment. My phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages from friends, former co-workers, and even some customers who'd been impressed by their experience during opening day. But the message that meant the most came from Mrs. Chen. She texted that she was proud of what I'd accomplished and looked forward to watching my franchise grow and succeed in the months and years ahead. As I drove home that night, I realized that the most satisfying part of the whole experience wasn't proving my family wrong about my potential. It was proving myself right about what was possible when you combine genuine passion for a business with disciplined planning and relentless execution. The next few weeks flew by as I settled into the routine of running my own McDonald's franchise. The initial excitement of opening day gave way to the daily challenges of managing inventory, scheduling staff, maintaining quality standards, and building a consistent customer base. The learning curve was steep, but my 3 years of restaurant experience proved invaluable. I understood the operational challenges that could derail service during busy periods, and I knew how to troubleshoot equipment problems and workflow bottlenecks before they became serious issues. My well-to-my staff responded management style, which emphasized teamwork and clear communication rather than rigid hierarchy. Because I'd worked every position in the restaurant, I could provide practical guidance when employees struggled with specific tasks or procedures. The financial performance during the first month exceeded all projections. We were averaging over $4,000 in daily sales, with particularly strong performance during breakfast and lunch rushes. The profit margins were tracking exactly where McDonald's corporate had predicted for a well-managed location in our demographic area. More importantly, we were building a reputation for excellent customer service and consistent food quality. Online reviews were overwhelmingly positive, and I noticed an increasing number of regular customers who were making our restaurant part of their daily routines. The success was gratifying, but what really drove me was the vision Mrs. Chen had helped me articulate. This single location was just the beginning. I wanted to build something substantial, something that would establish me as a serious player in the franchise restaurant industry. 6 weeks after opening, I received a call that would change everything. It was from Regional Development Manager Sarah Martinez at McDonald's Corporate. She'd been monitoring the performance of new franchises in the Southwest region, and my location had caught her attention. The sales numbers, customer satisfaction scores, and operational efficiency metrics were all ranking in the top tier for new franchises nationwide. She wanted to schedule a visit to discuss expansion opportunities. McDonald's actively encouraged successful franchisees to grow their territories, and there were several prime locations coming available in the Phoenix metropolitan area over the next 18 months. Would I be interested in exploring multi-unit development? This was exactly what I'd been hoping for, but the timing felt incredibly fast. Most franchisees waited at least 2 years before considering expansion, allowing their first location to stabilize and generate sufficient cash flow to support additional investments. But Sarah explained that my combination of strong financial position, operational expertise, and proven execution made me an ideal candidate for accelerated growth. The meeting took place on a Tuesday morning during our slower mid-morning period. Sarah arrived with a portfolio of potential locations, complete with demographic analysis, traffic studies, and revenue projections for each site. What she showed me was remarkable. There was a former restaurant location in Scottsdale that had been vacant for 8 months, situated in a busy shopping centre anchored by a major grocery store and several national retailers. The demographics were even more favourable than my current location, with higher average incomes and population density. McDonald's Corporate estimated annual revenue potential of $3.2 million for that site. The second opportunity was in Tempe, near the Arizona State University campus. College markets required different operational strategies, but they offered consistent year-round traffic and strong growth potential. The location had been identified through McDonald's site selection process, and preliminary negotiations with the property owner were already underway. Most intriguing was a third possibility that wouldn't become available for another year. A struggling franchisee in Glendale was considering selling his location due to health issues and retirement plans. This wouldn't require the full investment of building a new restaurant, since the existing infrastructure and customer base were already established. The challenge would be turning around operations and restoring profitability. Sarah explained the financial requirements for multi-unit development. Each new location would require approximately the same investment as my first restaurant, but McDonald's offered preferred financing terms for proven franchisees. More importantly, the cash flow from my existing location could support the debt service for expansion if I maintained current performance levels. The conversation shifted to operational considerations. Managing multiple locations required different skills than running a single restaurant. I'd need to develop systems for remote monitoring, establish clear communication protocols between sites, and delegate more responsibility to assistant managers and crew leaders. Sarah had worked with dozens of franchisees through expansion phases, and she emphasized that success depended on maintaining quality standards while scaling operations. The franchisees who struggled during growth were typically those who tried to expand too quickly or who failed to invest sufficient time in training and system development. We spent 2 hours reviewing the opportunities and discussing implementation timelines. By the end of the meeting, we'd outlined a preliminary expansion plan that would add the Scottsdale location within 9 months, followed by the Tempe site 6 months later. The Glendale acquisition would depend on negotiations with the current owner, but it could potentially happen within the next 18 months. After Sarah left, I sat in my office reviewing the documents she'd provided. The numbers were compelling, but the magnitude of what we'd discussed was overwhelming. I was looking at potentially quadrupling my business within 2 years, growing from a single location generating $3 million annually to 4 restaurants with combined revenue approaching $12 million. The financial implications were staggering. If I executed successfully, my net income could reach over $1 million annually within 3 years. That would put me in a completely different economic category than anyone in my family, including David with his successful financial advisory practice. But the risks were equally significant. Each expansion would require substantial additional investment and dramatically increase my operational complexity. If any location underperformed, or if I failed to maintain quality standards across multiple sites, the entire enterprise could be jeopardized. I needed advice from someone who understood the franchise restaurant business, so I called Mrs. Chen and asked if she'd be willing to discuss the expansion opportunities over dinner. She agreed immediately, suggesting a quiet restaurant where we could talk privately about the challenges and opportunities of multi-unit operations. Mrs. Chen had been through exactly what I was contemplating. She'd started with a single McDonald's location 12 years ago and gradually expanded to her current 3 restaurants. Her expansion insights about the process were invaluable. She confirmed that the operational challenges were real and significant. Managing multiple locations required systems thinking rather than hands-on management. I'd need to develop standardized procedures, implement consistent training programs, and establish metrics for monitoring performance across all sites. But she also emphasized the financial benefits of scale. Multiple locations provided diversification against temporary downturns at any single site. They also qualified for better terms with suppliers and allowed for more sophisticated marketing campaigns that could benefit all locations simultaneously. Most importantly, she helped me understand the timeline considerations. Expanding too quickly was one made. Each of the most common mistakes franchisees' new location required intensive management attention during the startup phase, and trying to launch multiple sites simultaneously could compromise performance at all locations. Her recommendation was to focus completely on the Scottsdale opportunity first, ensuring it achieved stable operations and profitability before considering additional expansion. The Tempe location could wait until the second restaurant was performing consistently, and the Glendale acquisition should only be pursued if the operational foundation was solid across multiple sites. We also discussed staffing strategies for multi-unit operations. I'd need to identify and develop assistant managers who could handle day-to-day operations with minimal supervision. This meant investing more time and resources in training programs and creating advancement opportunities that would retain talented employees. The conversation reinforced my confidence that expansion was the right strategic direction, but it also clarified the disciplined approach required for success. I couldn't treat additional locations as automatic revenue generators. Each one would require the same intensive planning, preparation, and execution that had made my first restaurant successful. Over the next several weeks, I developed a comprehensive expansion plan based on the guidance from Sarah and Mrs. Chen. The plan included detailed financial projections, operational timelines, staffing requirements, and risk management strategies for each phase of growth. I also began implementing systems at my current location that would support multi-unit operations. I established standardized reporting procedures, developed training documentation for all positions, and started cross-training my assistant managers to handle responsibilities I'd previously managed directly. The most important change was cultural. I started emphasizing to my team that we weren't just running a single McDonald's restaurant. We were building the foundation for a restaurant group that would eventually operate multiple locations throughout the Phoenix area. This vision excited my staff and helped attract higher caliber employees who saw opportunities for career advancement. 3 months after my meeting with Sarah, I submitted my formal application for the Scottsdale location. The process required updated financial documentation, detailed business plans, and multiple interviews with regional management. McDonald's corporate wanted to ensure that I had the resources and capabilities to manage expansion successfully. The approval process took 6 weeks, during which time my existing restaurant continued performing exceptionally well. We were consistently ranking in the top 20% of McDonald's locations nationwide for customer satisfaction scores, and our financial metrics remained strong despite increased competition from other restaurants that had opened in our area. When approval came through, the timeline accelerated quickly. Site preparation and construction would begin within 30 days, with a targeted opening date of 6 months later. I'd need to hire and train a complete management team for the new location, while maintaining operations at my existing restaurant. This was where the real test began. Everything I'd accomplished so far had been focused on a single location, where I could personally oversee every detail. Now I had to demonstrate that my systems and processes could be replicated successfully at a different site with different staff members. The hiring process for the Scottsdale location was crucial. I needed assistant managers who could operate independently while maintaining the quality standards and customer service approach that had made my first restaurant successful. I interviewed over 40 candidates before selecting 2 experienced restaurant managers who understood McDonald's systems and shared my commitment to operational excellence. Training the new team required adapting the knowledge and procedures I'd developed over 3 years into systematic programs that could be taught to others. This forced me to analyze and document aspects of restaurant operations that I'd been handling intuitively based on experience. The process was exhausting but educational. I discovered gaps in my own understanding that became apparent only when I tried to explain procedures to new employees. I also identified opportunities for improvement that hadn't been obvious when I was focused exclusively on daily operations at a single location. Construction of the Scottsdale restaurant proceeded on schedule, but managing the project while running my existing location stretched my time and attention to their limits. I was working 16-hour days, splitting time between overseeing construction progress, training new staff, and maintaining performance standards at my original restaurant. My family's reaction to the expansion announcement was fascinating. My parents seemed almost overwhelmed by the pace of my business growth. They'd spent 3 years thinking I was wasting my potential, and now they were struggling to keep up with developments that positioned me as a significant entrepreneur in the local market. David's response was more complex. He congratulated me on the expansion, but also expressed concern about the financial risks involved. As a financial advisor, he understood leverage and cash flow management, and he worried that I might be growing too quickly for my capital base to support safely. His concern was actually helpful because it forced me to review my financial projections with additional scrutiny. I worked with my accountant to model various scenarios, including potential downturns in performance or unexpected costs during the startup phase. The analysis confirmed that my expansion plan was financially sound, but it also identified potential stress points that required careful monitoring. Amanda's marketing background proved valuable during the pre-opening phase for Scottsdale. She helped develop promotional campaigns specifically targeted at the demographics of the new location, and she provided insights about social media strategies that could build awareness before the restaurant opened. The collaboration with Amanda was particularly meaningful because it represented a complete transformation in our relationship. Instead of dismissing my business ventures, she was now contributing her professional expertise to help ensure their success. The shift from condescension to collaboration reflected how dramatically my family's perception had changed over the past year. 6 weeks before the Scottsdale opening, I received another call from Sarah Martinez. McDonald's corporate had been monitoring my expansion progress, and they were impressed by the systematic approach I'd taken to multi-unit development. They wanted to discuss an opportunity that could accelerate my growth even further. A franchisee in Mesa was retiring and looking to sell 2 established McDonald's locations. Both restaurants were profitable and well-maintained, but they'd been operated conservatively without significant investment in equipment upgrades or promotional campaigns. McDonald's corporate believed the locations had potential for substantially improved performance under more aggressive management. This was the kind of opportunity that could transform my business overnight. Instead of building my restaurant group one location at a time, I could potentially acquire 2 established operations and focus on optimizing their performance. The existing customer bases, trained staff, and operational infrastructure would eliminate many of the startup challenges associated with new construction, but the financial requirements were substantial. The asking price for both locations was $3.8 million, which would require significantly more capital than I'd accumulated. Even with financing, I'd need to demonstrate liquid assets and cash flow capacity that stretched my resources to their limits. Sarah arranged for me to meet with the retiring franchisee, Robert Chen. No relation to Mrs. Chen despite the shared surname. Robert had operated McDonald's franchises for 18 years and built a reputation for steady, reliable operations. His locations weren't the highest performers in the region, but they were consistently profitable with strong community relationships. The meeting took place at one of his restaurants during a quiet afternoon period. Robert walked me through the operations, showing me the equipment, explaining the staffing structure, and reviewing the financial performance over the past 3 years. Both locations were generating steady cash flows, but there were obvious opportunities for improvement. The kitchen equipment at both sites needed updating to current McDonald's specifications. The promotional campaigns had been minimal, relying primarily on corporate advertising rather than local marketing initiatives. The staffing was adequate but not optimized, with higher labor costs than necessary due to inefficient scheduling. Most importantly, the customer service standards were acceptable but not exceptional. The staff was competent and experienced, but they lacked the enthusiasm and attention to detail that characterized high-performing McDonald's locations. Robert was honest about these limitations. He explained that he'd been focused on maintaining stable operations rather than pursuing aggressive growth or optimization. At his stage of life and career, he'd prioritize predictability over maximum profitability. But he also emphasized the strengths of both locations. They had loyal customer bases built over many years of consistent service. The sites were well positioned with strong traffic patterns and favorable demographics, The operational infrastructure was solid, requiring investment in upgrades rather than fundamental restructuring. The financial analysis was compelling but challenging. Combined, the two locations generated approximately $5.2 million in annual revenue with net profits of roughly $620,000 per year. With operational improvements and modernization, the profit potential could easily exceed $850,000 annually. However, the acquisition would require me to secure financing for nearly $4 million, while maintaining sufficient working capital to support operations across potentially 4 locations simultaneously. The debt service would consume most of the cash flow from the acquired restaurants during the first 2 years, leaving little margin for error or unexpected challenges. I asked Robert for 2 weeks to analyze the opportunity and determine whether I could structure the financing appropriately. He agreed, acknowledging that the decision represented a significant commitment that shouldn't be rushed. The next 2 weeks were intensive. I worked with my accountant, met with multiple lenders, and developed detailed financial models for various acquisition scenarios. I also spent considerable time at both locations, observing operations and identifying specific improvement opportunities. The analysis confirmed that the acquisition made financial sense if I could execute the operational improvements successfully. The existing cash flows were sufficient to support the debt service, and the upside potential was substantial if I could implement the systems and standards that had made my first location successful. But the personal and professional risks were equally substantial. I'd be committing to manage 4 McDonald's locations simultaneously while still in the process of opening my second restaurant. The operational complexity would increase exponentially, and any significant problems at multiple locations could jeopardize the entire enterprise. The decision ultimately came down to my confidence in the systems and procedures I'd developed over the past year. If my approach to restaurant operations was genuinely superior to industry standards, then acquiring established locations and improving their performance should be feasible. If my success had been primarily due to favorable circumstances or beginner's luck, then rapid expansion could expose those limitations catastrophically. After extensive analysis and soul-searching, I decided to proceed with the acquisition. The potential rewards justified the risks, and I believed my systematic approach to operations management could generate the improvements necessary to make the investment successful. The financing negotiations were complex but ultimately successful. I arranged a combination of conventional business loans and seller financing that provided the necessary capital while maintaining manageable debt service requirements. Robert agreed to remain available as a consultant during the transition period, which would help ensure continuity of operations while I implemented changes. The announcement of the acquisition generated significant attention in local business circles. The Phoenix Business Journal ran a feature article about my rapid growth from single restaurant owner to multi-unit franchisee within 18 months. The article included interviews with Sarah Martinez and Mrs. Chen, both of whom praised my systematic approach to expansion and operational excellence. But the most satisfying reaction came from my family during our next Sunday dinner. Instead of the usual dynamic where David and Amanda dominated the conversation with their corporate achievements, everyone was genuinely interested in hearing about my business developments and expansion plans. My dad asked detailed questions about the financial structuring of the acquisition and seemed impressed by the complexity of the deal I'd negotiated. My mum wanted to understand how I'd manage 4 locations simultaneously and what systems I'd developed to maintain quality standards across multiple sites. David's questions were particularly sophisticated, focusing on cash flow management, debt service coverage, and risk mitigation strategies. The conversation felt like a consultation between business peers rather than a family dinner where the successful siblings patronized their underachieving brother. Amanda was excited about the marketing opportunities that came with operating multiple locations. She suggested coordinated promotional campaigns that could leverage economies of scale and create stronger brand presence throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was contributing to family conversations as an equal, rather than as someone who needed advice or encouragement. The transformation was as personally satisfying as the business success that had made it possible. The integration of the acquired locations proceeded more smoothly than I'd anticipated. Robert's staff was experienced and professional, and they responded positively to the operational improvements and system upgrades I implemented. Within 3 months, both locations were showing measurable improvements in customer satisfaction scores and financial performance. The Scottsdale restaurant opening went flawlessly, benefiting from all the lessons I'd learned during my first launch. The staff was better trained, the promotional campaigns were more sophisticated, and the operational systems were refined based on 18 months of multi-unit experience. By the end of my second year as a McDonald's franchisee, I was operating 4 successful locations with combined annual revenue approaching $11 million. My net income had grown to over $900,000 annually, putting me in the top tier of McDonald's franchisees nationwide. The financial transformation was remarkable, but the personal satisfaction came from proving that success in the restaurant industry required the same skills and dedication as any other business. I demonstrated that working at McDonald's hadn't been a dead-end job, but rather an intensive education in operations management, customer service, and business systems. The respect I'd earned from my family, colleagues, and industry peers was gratifying, but it was secondary to the knowledge that I'd built something substantial and sustainable. The restaurant group I'd created would continue generating value for employees, customers, and the community long after the initial satisfaction of proving doubters wrong had faded. Looking ahead, I could see opportunities for continued growth and development. McDonald's corporate had approached me about potential expansion into markets outside Arizona, and there were possibilities for diversification into other franchise concepts or restaurant industry investments. But for now, I was focused on optimizing the operations I'd built and ensuring that each location continued performing at the highest levels. The foundation was solid, the systems were proven, and the trajectory was established. Everything else would build from there. The journey from dismissed family member to successful entrepreneur had taken 4 years of disciplined planning, relentless execution, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but each phase had built logically on the previous one, creating momentum that eventually became unstoppable. Most importantly, I'd learned that success wasn't about the respect or recognition of others, though those were welcome byproducts. Real success came from identifying opportunities others couldn't see, developing capabilities others wouldn't invest in building, and executing plans others didn't have the patience or persistence to complete. The McDonald's uniform that had once symbolized failure and limitation had actually been the foundation for everything that followed. Sometimes the most unlikely starting points lead to the most extraordinary destinations. The real test of my success wasn't the financial statements or the media coverage, it was what happened 6 months later when my family faced their own crisis. David's investment firm was under investigation for questionable practices with client portfolios. Amanda's tech company had been acquired, and she was facing potential layoffs as the new owners restructured operations. My parents were dealing with unexpected medical expenses that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, they'd positioned themselves as the stable, successful members of the family while treating me like a charity case. Now, when real problems emerged, they turned to the brother they'd spent decades mocking. David called first. His voice was different from any conversation we'd ever had, stripped of the condescending confidence that had defined our relationship. The investigation wasn't going well, and his legal fees were mounting faster than his savings could cover them. He needed a bridge loan to maintain his lifestyle while the regulatory issues were resolved. Could I help? The request was for $80,000. Not an enormous sum relative to my current income, but substantial enough to matter. What struck me wasn't the amount, but the complete reversal of our dynamic. David, who'd spent years lecturing me about financial responsibility, was asking his McDonald's working brother for a bailout. Amanda's situation was more complex but equally desperate. The acquisition of her company had been structured in a way that eliminated most employee positions within 18 months. She had severance benefits, but not her expensive enough to maintain lifestyle while searching for equivalent employment. She needed time to pivot her career, potentially starting her own consulting practice, but she lacked the capital to bridge the transition period. Her request was for $60,000, presented as an investment opportunity in her future consulting business. She'd developed a detailed business plan and projected substantial returns within 3 years. The presentation was professionally prepared, but the underlying reality was that she needed financial help to avoid a dramatic reduction in her standard of living. My parents' situation was the most emotionally complicated. Dad's heart surgery had been successful, but the recovery period was longer than anticipated, and Mum had taken extended leave from her part-time job to care for him. Their medical insurance covered most of the surgical costs, But the follow-up treatments, medications, and lost income created a financial strain they hadn't experienced since their early marriage. They weren't asking for money directly. Instead, Mum called to explain the situation and mentioned how proud they were of my business success. She wondered if I had any advice about managing unexpected financial challenges. The subtext was clear, but they couldn't bring themselves to explicitly ask their formerly unsuccessful son for help. Each request forced me to confront questions about family, loyalty, and the meaning of success that I hadn't fully considered during my rapid business expansion. These were the same people who'd dismissed my potential for years, who'd made jokes about my career choices at every family gathering, who'd treated my ambitions as unrealistic fantasies. But they were also my family. David had been condescending, but he'd never been intentionally cruel. Amanda had made jokes about my job, but she'd also celebrated my birthday every year and remembered details about my life that showed she cared, even if she didn't respect my choices. My parents had been patronizing, but they'd also provided support during difficult periods, even if that support came wrapped in disappointment about my direction. The financial calculations were straightforward. I could afford to help all of them without jeopardizing my business operations or expansion plans. The combined requests totaled less than $200,000, which represented roughly 2 months of net income from my 4 restaurants. But the personal calculations were infinitely more complex. Helping them would demonstrate generosity and family loyalty, but it would also establish a precedent that could become problematic if their financial difficulties continued or worsened. More importantly, unconditional assistance might prevent them from learning the lessons about humility and resilience that their circumstances were trying to teach. I decided to handle each situation differently, based on the specific dynamics of each relationship and the underlying causes of their problems. David's legal troubles were partially self-inflicted, resulting from aggressive investment strategies that had crossed ethical boundaries. I agreed to provide the bridge loan he requested, but with conditions that reflected the business principles I'd learned during my own financial struggles. The loan would carry market rate interest, include personal guarantees secured by his assets, and require monthly progress reports on the legal proceedings. The terms weren't punitive, but they were professional rather than familial. David would receive the help he needed, but he'd also experience the discipline and accountability that came with serious financial obligations. If he learned from the experience and restored his professional reputation, the loan would be repaid according to schedule. If he failed to address the underlying issues that created the crisis, he'd face consequences that might motivate better decision-making in the future. Amanda's consulting venture represented a more promising investment opportunity. Her marketing expertise was genuine, and the business plan she'd developed was sophisticated and realistic. I agreed to provide the $60,000 she'd requested, but structured as equity investment rather than a loan. She'd retain majority ownership of her consulting practice, but I'd receive a percentage of profits that reflected the risk and capital I was providing. This arrangement aligned our interests and gave Amanda genuine accountability for the success of her new business. If her consulting practice thrived, we'd both benefit financially. If it struggled, she'd need to answer to an investor who understood business operations and wouldn't accept excuses about market conditions or competitive challenges. My parents' situation required the most careful consideration. Their financial strain was temporary and resulted from circumstances beyond their control rather than poor decision-making. They'd lived modestly throughout their careers and had prepared responsibly for retirement. The medical expenses were an unexpected burden that could be resolved with appropriate assistance. I arranged to cover their medical bills directly, paying the outstanding balances to hospitals and physicians rather than providing cash that might be diverted to other purposes. I also established a monthly supplement to their income during Dad's recovery period, ensuring they could maintain their basic lifestyle without depleting retirement savings they'd need for future security. But the assistance came with a condition that addressed the broader family dynamics that had shaped our relationships for decades. I asked them to host a family dinner, where we could discuss how we'd all changed over the past few years and what we wanted our relationships to look like going forward. The dinner took place on a Sunday evening in early March, almost 3 years after I'd first started working at McDonald's. The setting was familiar, but everything else had transformed. Instead of David and Amanda dominating the conversation with their professional achievements while I sat quietly absorbing their condescension, we were gathering as adults who'd all faced significant challenges and learned from them. Dad looked older but healthier than he had in months. The surgery had been successful, and his recovery was progressing well. Mum seemed relieved that the financial pressures were manageable and grateful that the family had rallied during a difficult period. David appeared humbled by his legal troubles but determined to rebuild his reputation and practice. Amanda was excited about her consulting venture and energized by the prospect of building something of her own. The conversation that evening was unlike any we'd ever had as adults. Instead of competitive status updates and subtle put-downs, we talked honestly about mistakes we'd made, lessons we'd learned, and ways we could support each other more effectively going forward. David acknowledged that his condescending attitude toward my career had been unfair and short-sighted. He'd measured success exclusively by salary and job titles, failing to recognize the business education I was receiving or the strategic planning I was developing. His recent troubles had taught him that professional success could be fragile and that character mattered more than credentials in determining long-term outcomes. Amanda apologized for the jokes and dismissive comments she'd made about my McDonald's job. She'd failed to understand that I was building expertise and developing capabilities that would translate into entrepreneurial success. Her own transition from corporate employee to business owner had given her new appreciation for the risks and challenges I'd navigated during my expansion. My parents expressed genuine pride in what I'd accomplished, but also regret about the years they'd spent treating my potential as limited. They'd fallen into the trap of equating conventional career paths with success, missing the unconventional approach I was taking to build something substantial and meaningful. But the most important part of the conversation was forward-looking rather than retrospective. We discussed how we wanted to interact as a family now that we were all dealing with adult responsibilities and challenges. The old dynamic of successful siblings and struggling brother was obsolete, replaced by a more complex reality where everyone faced different types of pressures and opportunities. We agreed that future family gatherings would focus on mutual support rather than competitive achievement updates. We'd celebrate successes together and provide assistance during difficulties without judgment or condescension. Most importantly, we'd respect each other's choices and approaches even when they differed from our own preferences or expectations. The transformation in our family relationships was gradual but genuine. David's legal troubles were eventually resolved through negotiated settlements that allowed him to continue practicing with enhanced compliance procedures. His business recovered slowly, and he rebuilt his client base with a more conservative approach that prioritized ethical standards over aggressive returns. Amanda's consulting practice exceeded even her optimistic projections. Her corporate experience combined with entrepreneurial energy created a service offering that resonated strongly with mid-sized companies looking to improve their marketing effectiveness. Within 18 months, she was generating six-figure annual income and considering expansion into additional markets. My parents' recovery was complete within 6 months. Dad's health improved steadily, and they were able to resume their normal activities and social relationships. The financial assistance I'd provided was temporary, ending as soon as Dad could return to part-time work and their income stabilized. But the most significant change was in how we related to each other during family gatherings and regular communication. The hierarchies and competitions that had defined our interactions for decades were replaced by genuine interest in each other's lives and mutual respect for different paths to success and fulfillment. My restaurant business continued growing during this period. I opened a 5th location in Chandler, expanding my territorial coverage and further diversifying my revenue base. The operational systems I'd developed were scalable and effective, allowing me to maintain quality standards while managing increased complexity. McDonald's corporate recognized my success by featuring my expansion story in their internal newsletter for franchisees. The article highlighted the systematic approach I'd taken to growth and the operational excellence that had enabled rapid scaling without compromising performance. More importantly, I was invited to participate in McDonald's National Advisory Council, a group of successful franchisees who provided input on corporate policies and strategic initiatives. The appointment was both an honor and a responsibility, connecting me with the most sophisticated operators in the McDonald's system and giving me influence on decisions nationwide. The recognition from that affected thousands of restaurants McDonald's corporate was gratifying. But the real satisfaction came from the knowledge that I'd built something sustainable and meaningful. My restaurants employed over 200 people, served thousands of customers daily, and contributed to the economic vitality of the communities where they operated. The financial success was substantial, but secondary to the personal growth I'd experienced during the journey from dismissed family member to respected business leader. The skills I'd developed, relationships I'd built, and confidence I'd gained were assets that would serve me well regardless of future business directions or opportunities. Looking back on the transformation, I realized that the most valuable lesson wasn't about business strategy or financial planning. It was about the importance of persistence and self-belief when pursuing goals that others don't understand or support. Success often comes from seeing opportunities where others see limitations and maintaining commitment when others would give up. The McDonald's uniform that had once represented failure and embarrassment had become the foundation for everything that followed. The job that my family had mocked as dead-end had provided the education, experience, and credibility necessary to build a multi-million-dollar business. But perhaps most importantly, the journey had taught me that respect and recognition from others, while pleasant, weren't the ultimate measures of success. Real success came from identifying meaningful goals, developing the capabilities necessary to achieve them, and executing plans with discipline and persistence regardless of external opinions or obstacles. The family dynamics that had once been a source of pain and frustration had evolved into relationships based on mutual respect and genuine support. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it had required difficult conversations and honest self-reflection from everyone involved. But the result was a family structure that enhanced, rather than diminished, everyone's individual success and happiness. As I stood in my newest restaurant during the grand opening celebration, watching my parents, David and Amanda, interact with my employees and customers, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond financial achievement or business recognition. I'd not only built a successful enterprise, but had also helped transform the relationships that mattered most in my life. The journey from McDonald's employee to franchise owner had taken 4 years of disciplined effort and strategic planning. The evolution from family disappointment to respected business leader had required even more patience and persistence. But both transformations had been worth every challenge, setback, and moment of doubt along the way. The future held possibilities for continued growth, both personal and professional. There were opportunities to expand into new markets, diversify into additional franchise concepts, and potentially transition into other business ventures. But those decisions would be made from a position of strength and confidence, rather than desperation or the need to prove doubters wrong. The most important lesson I'd learned was that success wasn't about changing other people's opinions or earning their approval. It was about staying true to your own vision, developing the capabilities necessary to achieve your goals, and maintaining persistence even when the path forward seemed uncertain or unsupported by those around you. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most extraordinary outcomes, and sometimes the people who doubt you the most become your strongest supporters once you prove what's possible through dedication, intelligence, and relentless execution. The most rewarding part wasn't the money or even the vindication of proving everyone wrong. It was watching my employees grow and develop their own career paths within the organization I'd built. Maria, who'd started as a part-time crew member at my first location, had worked her way up to assistant manager and was now being Chandler Restaurant trained to run the. James, a college student who'd initially planned to work just one pay-for-text semester toward a passion for restaurant books, had discovered a management track that operations and was pursuing opportunity. Some success stories remind could lead to his own franchise day. That's to me why I'd fallen in love with the restaurant business in the first place. It wasn't just about profit margins and operational attitude, it was about creating opportunities efficiency, though those aim for people to learn, grow, and build better futures for themselves and their families. The ripple effects extended beyond my immediate employees. Local suppliers benefited from the consistent business my 5 locations generated. The communities where my restaurants operated received economic activity, tax revenue, and gathering places where neighbors could connect. Even small things like sponsoring Little League teams and supporting school fundraisers created positive impacts that went far beyond the financial transactions. Today, those 5 restaurants generate over $14 million in annual revenue, and my net worth has grown to $2.4 million. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the moment my family finally understood that success isn't defined by traditional paths or other people's expectations. It's defined by vision, persistence, and the courage to see opportunity where others see failure. The McDonald's uniform they mocked became the foundation of everything I built, and sometimes the people who doubt you the most end up learning the most valuable lessons about what's truly possible when you refuse to give up on yourself.